Hundreds of prisoners set to be released as part of agreement with outgoing Biden administration to remove Cuba from terrorism sponsor list. In a significant diplomatic breakthrough, the US and Cuban governments have reached an agreement that will lead to the release of more than 500 prisoners, some of whom were arrested during the massive street protests in Cuba in July 2021. This deal, negotiated through the Vatican, is also tied to a major shift in US foreign policy, removing Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, SSOT, a designation that had been placed on the island nation during the final days of Donald Trump's first term in office. One of the most well-known figures involved in the protests was Maykel Vivero, a journalist and LGBTQ+ activist, who was detained during the demonstrations and brought to a detention center on the outskirts of Havana. He recalls being thrown into a crowded cell, unsure if he would ever leave. Though Gonzalez was released that very night, many of those arrested alongside him did not share the same fate. Now, thanks to this new agreement, hundreds of those detained during the July protests, including some high-profile activists, will regain their freedom. Cuban officials have emphasized that the prisoners were not political prisoners, but individuals who had been convicted according to Cuban law for crimes such as sedition. However, there is no denying that many of those arrested during the protests were openly opposing the government, and their release is seen as a significant step toward easing tensions between the two nations. On January 15, 2025, Cuba confirmed the release of at least 13 individuals involved in the protests, including 11 who were arrested for sedition, one of whom was only 17 years old at the time of his arrest. While Cuba has sought to downplay any suggestion of a quid pro quo, the agreement is linked to a reversal of one of the Trump administration's final acts, placing Cuba back on the U.S. Department of State's list of state sponsors of terrorism. This list, which also includes North Korea, Iran, and Syria, had a significant impact on Cuba's economy, making it harder for Cubans to travel to the United States and increasing the difficulty of doing business on the island. The lifting of the designation, along with the suspension of other sanctions on Cuban businesses and the lifting of a law allowing Cuban Americans to sue for compensation over confiscated property, marks a substantial shift in US-Cuba relations. The move has caught many observers by surprise, particularly given the current political climate. Maykel Bustamante, a professor of Cuban and Cuban-American studies at the University of Miami, noted that while these changes were a long-held aspiration of Cuba, they were unexpected under the outgoing Biden administration. However, with the incoming Trump administration expected to reverse much of Biden's policies, the future of US-Cuba relations remains uncertain. Many are concerned that the removal of the SSOT designation may make Cuba a more attractive target for future U.S. policy action, especially considering Trump's past rhetoric about Cuba being a terrorist sponsor. The release of prisoners has been seen as a crucial aspect of the agreement, and it is widely viewed as a positive step toward easing political tensions. Still, there are many questions about which prisoners will be released and whether the government will include prominent figures such as artist Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara and activist Jose Daniel Ferrer. Observers will be closely monitoring how quickly the releases occur and whether the Cuban government will use the releases as a form of leverage to buy time with the new U.S. administration. Although Biden's policy shift has been praised by some as a way to stem the economic decline in Cuba and decrease migration numbers, it remains to be seen whether these changes will lead to long-term improvements in US-Cuba relations or if they will be quickly reversed once Trump assumes office. One thing is clear, however: the release of hundreds of prisoners and the removal of Cuba from the SSOT list represent a crucial moment in the evolving relationship between the two nations.